Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is Amber Mace, and I am the Executive Director of the California Council on Science and Technology, and I am so grateful that you could take some time to join us today. We have a great lineup for you, and I'm thrilled that you want to learn more about our CCST Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. I'm going to start out by telling you a little bit about our organization, and then I'm going to turn it over to our program manager for the fellowship, Jeffery, who's going to give you some details about the fellowship and why it's a great opportunity. And then he's going to host a conversation with some of our alums so you can hear directly from fellows, including Jeffery, about the fellowship experience and ask your questions. I do encourage you to go to our website as well, where we have a frequently asked questions page. There are a lot of answers there, though having a chance to talk to the fellows today is a really wonderful opportunity. So I'm really grateful that we have alums who are willing to take some time out of their busy schedules to have this conversation with you. So let me go ahead and start with the first slide, please, Jeffery, and share with you about the California Council on Science and Technology. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit. We were created at the request of the legislature. They recognized back in 1988 that California needs a better way to access the wealth of knowledge and expertise that's created throughout California and our research and academic partners, and that they wanted to have this information more accessible to decision makers so science could inform policy. And so that's primarily what we focus on. Next slide. And we do this by tapping into this network of expertise. These are all our formal partners, and we rely on our partners to provide us directly with the people who can answer the questions that the state decision makers have. And these can be big questions or little questions. And so next slide, please. We can answer questions in many different ways. And so I want to walk you through some of the products and services that we provide in addition to the fellowship, and I'll wrap up with the fellowship and turn it over to Jeffery. So decision makers need information on different timescales and at different levels of detail, depending on what the topic is. Sometimes they need a really in-depth look from an independent perspective at a very complex topic that might be technologically really difficult to untangle. So this could be something like how much do wildfires cost California, or what do we know about hydraulic fracturing in the state? And so this is when we pull together a team of experts from that network of expertise that I mentioned to let the state know what the science says. And we do this in a way that the decision makers can understand. We can do this also in more short-term products, and these can be our workshops or our briefings. It really depends on what the need is. And so we really focused on, what do decision makers need? How do they get their information? How can we deliver it more efficiently to them? How can we make it easy for them to bring science into the discussion? And one of the best ways, hands down, that we do this is through our fellowship program. So I am absolutely thrilled that you're here to learn about the fellowship program. I think that there isn't a better time for us to be delivering a program where scientists serve directly with decision makers. They have this opportunity to break down the barriers between speaking different languages, operating on different time frames, and being in the room to really have a chance to bring science into the conversation. And this is in a state that is just unparalleled in the type of policy that we produce, and you'll hear more about that from Jeffery. I think that this is a fantastic program because you get an opportunity to really help shape policy, not only for the 5th largest economy in the world, but for the nation. And so with that, I am very pleased to turn it over to Jeffery Song, who's the Fellowship Program Manager.
Thank you, Amber. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeffery Song. I am the manager of the CCST Science Fellows Program. Also an alum of the program. I was a 2018 CCST Science Fellow, and I now get to work to help other PhD scientists and engineers like yourselves explore a career in public policy through this fellowship. This year, we're recruiting a cohort of 15 fellows to spend a year of public service working in California state legislative and now also executive branch offices. Just a little bit of background, we're about to welcome our 2021 fellowship cohort this fall, which is going to be our 12th year. And we're currently recruiting for the 2022 fellows cohort, which will be beginning next November. And now we've trained over 113 PhD scientists and engineers through this fellowship. So why apply to become a CCST Science Fellow? As a fellow, you'll get to learn about how government and decision-making happens firsthand by being in the room and learning through the experience of being a staffer in a government office. You get to apply the skills you've developed in your research training and your extracurricular activities to help advise decision makers and impact California policies. And finally, this is a year of professional growth, exploration, and transformation as you try something new and get to work in a policy environment. You don't need to have a strong California connection to apply to the CCST program. I didn't. You just need to show an interest in learning about and serving the state of California, which has quickly become my home through this fellowship. The work you do as a fellow here in California will have implications far beyond the state. California is a leader in many policy areas, and the policies of the state are often replicated by other states. It's replicated at the federal level, as well as even other countries. Also, the work you do as a fellow will impact the state that has nearly 40 million people, and as California policymakers and people here love to say, is the 5th largest economy in the world. As I have said, as a CCST Science Fellow, you're going to be placed directly into a government office, either in the legislature or in one of the agencies, departments, boards, or governor's office that make up the California executive branch. And you get to work as a full-time staff member in that office for the year. What this means is that this fellowship is a direct learning opportunity to participate in the policymaking process firsthand. And you get to see what it's like to be in the room where decisions are being made. Now, alongside this experiential learning you'll be doing in your placement office, the program is going to give you the support and additional training you need to be both successful in that office, as well as beyond for your career search. So prior to placement, you're going to go through a month-long policy boot camp where you'll learn the ins and outs of California government and the policymaking processes before you begin. This will also be a time for you to connect with your cohort, which will be your primary kind of source of support through your fellowship year. Throughout the fellowship, you will participate in seminars and workshops to expand your network and learn new professional skills. And you'll receive mentorship from our large alumni network who have come before you. And now, speaking of our alumni through this fellowship expressed that this experience, and you'll hear from them soon, has been instrumental to their career development and opening up opportunities they would have never known about while in their PhD or postdoc programs. The vast majority of our alumni go into policy-related careers after the fellowship, and many of them stay within the California state government, either in the legislature or executive branch, or adjacent at our nonprofits or research institutes that help with the policy process. Here's a quote that kind of really captures the sentiment of the opportunities that this fellowship provides fellows. This program will give you the structure, the training, and access to help you make and build your career path forward. So what are we looking for? So we're looking for individuals who we expect to be able to thrive in this policymaking environment. This is going to be a big culture change from academia, and it'll require you to be an excellent communicator. It'll require you to be a team player in your office, to be flexible and adaptable to the ever-changing environments in the policy world, as well as require you to be open-minded and willing to learn as you're adapting into a very new work environment. We're going to be looking for these skills in your application materials and throughout the selection and interview process. So let's talk a little bit about our timeline. Our application is opening in just 6 weeks on December 1st, and they'll be due in March. Our selection process and our interviews will happen in April and May for offers to be made in June, and then the fellowship for this cohort will begin next November. For those of you who may be looking at future cycles, it's a very similar timeline, just add an additional year. For this year, you do not need to have your PhD in hand to apply in December or between December and March. We just require that you have a plan and are ready to finish and complete all of your PhD requirements by September of next year so that you'll be done before you begin the fellowship in November. That concludes the presentation part of this webinar. So before we move into the Q&A, I just wanted to please connect with us on social media through our Twitter and Facebook or LinkedIn, as well as please email me if you have any specific questions or concerns about the program that weren't addressed in this presentation or won't get covered in this Q&A portion. All right, thank you very much. I'm now gonna ask bring online our panel of wonderful alumni. Yay. Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for coming and giving your wonderful wisdom and advice to the next prospective group of applicants. I'm gonna just start by having you all introduce yourselves, sharing a little bit about your background, where you did your PhD, where you did your placement for the fellowship, as well as where you're doing now. And then talking a little bit about, from your experience as a prospective applicant, what your expectations were for the fellowship when you applied, and a little bit about your experience and how that matched. So we're gonna start with Sydney.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Hi, everyone. My name is Sydney Chamberlin. My PhD is in physics, and I use data science in my research to search for tiny signals called gravitational waves that are produced in astrophysical processes. So my background is basically astrophysics. I was a year 10 science fellow, which was in 2019, and I spent that year working as a consultant for the Senate Committee on Natural Resources and Water, where I analyzed legislation related to public lands, coastal resource management, invasive species, and climate change. Now I work on climate policy here in California with the Nature Conservancy, or TNC for short, which is a global environmental NGO. And at TNC, we focus on thinking about ways we can use nature to help us fight climate change. So why did I apply for the fellowship? You know, it came down to a few things. I grew up in a really politically vocal family, and I was always really interested in the policy world. For a long time, I thought I'd be a scientist first and just sort of learn about politics and dabble in advocacy on the side. But as a scientist, I came to realize that I really liked talking about my science more than I liked doing it. I'm really passionate about effective science communication and about using science for the greater good. And after I finished my PhD and did 3 years of postdoc work, I just felt like something was missing in my career. And I think for me, service is a really important value, and I wanted to find work that better aligned with that value and that had positive, tangible impact that I could see. I'm also really a social person, and research felt really isolating to me. So I wanted to find work that was a more social environment and maybe a little bit more dynamic. I would say the fellowship really lived up to my experience. It was a really positive experience. Definitely had challenges for sure. I learned a tremendous amount, both about the policy world and the policy landscape, the political process, but also about myself. And I feel like at the end, I found a really vibrant community here in Sacramento. And now I'm doing work that I think really has the kind of impact I'd hoped for. It's also tremendously intellectually stimulating, which is good. So I really couldn't be happier. I think the fellowship did a great job of living up to my expectations.
Next is Lashe.
Hi, I'm Lashe Cobley. I got my PhD at the University of Utah, and I studied plants in cities, and I was really trying to use the leaf chemistry of plants to tell stories about where nitrogen was in the city. And it turned out to be a rather surprising story about pollution. My trees and then the soils, and then later I measured it in the atmosphere, all pointed to the fact that there were higher concentrations of pollution in lower income areas. And I did all of the things, you know, I published a ton, I went to conferences, I spoke about it, and I was like, okay, so what are we gonna do about this? Like, this is a problem. Are we gonna do something? And they're like, you're gonna ask more questions and you're gonna hand over your work to other people, and they're gonna go down that path, and you're gonna go down the path of more research questions. And I was a little unsatisfied by that, to say the least. And so I came to CCST really wanting to understand, how do you use science to impact people, right? We know that there are major things about science that impact people every day, but they may not have the chance to think about. And I was like, how can I be effective in this space? I will say, for as much as I wanted to make change, I also came into this fellowship very undecided. I had a postdoc lined up afterwards and was like, I have my escape if I don't like this. And so part of coming to CCST was also about professional development. And I stayed. So I was placed in the office of the chair at the California Air Resources Board. And after my fellowship, decided to stay at CARB. And I think part of the deciding factor was, throughout this year, feeling like I was specifically making the change that I wanted to see, even though it was slower. But I just was sort of reassured throughout the year that, like, this is where I wanted to be. And there were so many experiences that was like, yeah, this feels right. And I think I went in wanting to have that feeling. I think that answered all the questions.
Thank you, Lashe. And attendees, as you guys are listening to the panelist share, if there's any follow-up questions that you have, please drop them in the Q&A below. All right. Next is Geoff.
Hi, I'm Geoff Hollett. I got my PhD in material science and engineering at the University of California, San Diego, where I was studying the next generation of birth control technology, specifically targeted at women in sub-Saharan Africa. I came to CCST after some self-examination of sort of where my skill sets aligned with some of the peers that I was working with in my lab, realizing that the activities that I found most satisfying in the lab were things like going to conferences, giving presentations, taking meetings, interfacing with some of the nonprofits that were working in this space, and ultimately coming to the realization, similar to Lashe's story, is that, I mean, while my project was very personally gratifying, medical research takes a long, long time to ever actually make it to the market and to impact people's lives. So instead of transitioning into, say, a small startup company, my approach was to sort of tackle leadership from the top down. And that was what brought me here. I was placed in the personal office of State Senator Bob Archuleta. He's a Democrat representing a group of cities in Southeast Los Angeles County and a little bit of Northwest Orange County, where I staff him on all technology and healthcare related projects, including consumer protections, professional licensure, anything that goes through the judiciary. As Sydney was alluding to, it's an incredibly intellectually stimulating placement job that covers a broad range of material that requires a really inquisitive mind. And I would say that it absolutely has lived up to my expectations. While I'm a current fellow, I'm still currently wrapping up my fellowship. While it wasn't exactly the year I anticipated, one of the things that I did really spend a lot of time thinking about is, do I belong? That was the biggest question that I had coming in, is what is the role of a scientist and can I do it? And even with the fractured year and the uncertainty, the thing that became crystal clear to me was that people like myself, like Chanel, like Lashe, like Sydney, we belong in this space. We can do it, right? Like our backgrounds really make us unique resources for the policymaking process. And it's been incredibly satisfying and by far the most satisfying year of my career to this point.
Thank you, Geoff. And then we'll close with Chanel.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Hi, everyone. My name is Chanel Matney. I was a CCST Science Fellow in 2019, which was year 10, the same year as my lovely friend and colleague, Sydney. I earned my PhD in neuroscience from the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in Baltimore, Maryland. And it was then, even midway through my graduate career, that I turned to science policy and advocacy as the answer to a crisis of conscience I was having at that time, wanting to understand, as so many of the other panelists have said, how am I going to advance the mission of science to further better outcomes for my community, literally in an ivory tower, given that my lab was on the 9th floor, in downtown Baltimore. But I felt incredibly separate from my friends, neighbors, and community members that lived with me in Baltimore City. And so just sort of by nature of observation, I mean, Baltimore is an incredibly vibrant community that I very quickly fell in love with, a majority Black city, but with majority white academic institutions and a host of challenges related to substance abuse, food deserts, reproductive justice, environmental justice, the list goes on. And I felt to myself that, what role must science be playing in advocating for change on these really pressing societal problems? And so as a grad student, looking for a platform to sort of have an outlet for this sort of a passion, some fellow grad students and I co-founded Johns Hopkins Science Policy Group. And from there, I began to find myself immersing in that really rich science policy community. And so after that, I sort of bounced around a number of really enriching opportunities in the DMV, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. But it felt a little bit still like the outside looking in. At my heart, I will always be an advocate and really appreciated what I felt as a civic duty to go and petition my lawmakers to consider the scientific aspect of the key question before them. And then I thought to myself, what if I just worked for that decision maker myself, and instead of having 5 minutes, on a quarterly basis, I'd be a full-time advisor. And so I was looking for an opportunity to get, to be in the room where it happened, as so many others have said. So I was just so delighted to find out about CCST, also delighted to experience the West Coast. And we know that California sort of sits at the edge of really transformative, exciting, forward-thinking, progressive science and technology issues on energy, land use, natural resources, education. So I said, let me hop on over and just kind of be inside of a different culture. And what was so gratifying was finding my people, finding folks with shared values, folks who are as equally committed to the vision that science and technology policy have to be thoughtfully and intentionally leveraged to advance a more prosperous, a more equitable society, to conserve a resilient and sustainable planet. And so it was just so fulfilling and very affirming, finding my calling in that. So I was placed as a fellow in the Committee for Education, where, wow, I mean, they let you work on some real heavy hitting policy. I worked on education policy to expand economic mobility for college athletes. I worked on policy that increased scholarship opportunities for former foster youth. I advised on a policy relating to how early can school start in the morning, given what we know about the neuroscience of circadian rhythms in our adolescence, just a wide range of things. So it was incredibly satisfying and humbling to be in a role where you could bridge the gap between your academic background and those skills and a difficult policy decision. So after that, I stuck around for a while and continued working as a legislative staffer, this time in transportation. So I like to say, as a neuroscientist, I went from brains to trains and planes, but it was all still networks and thinking about how to remove metabolic waste from the environment, carbon. And again, there, I worked on mobility as an equity issue, right? Mobility is the way that you can freely move to access service and resources in your community. So are you doing that through scooters or share bikes? Are you using transit? Are you using a traditional gas-powered automobile or electric or hydrogen fuel, and what does that mean for our emissions future? So really, really fascinating stuff. But today, for the neuroscientists in the room, I was really excited to get back to my dorsal roots, where I now work for the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in their Forum for Neuroscience. And there I manage a portfolio of programs looking at the future of traumatic brain injury research in the context of our armed service members and the challenges that they face. So as you can see from my background, there are a lot of ways that I sort of satisfied my desire to fulfill this mission, whether it was education, transportation or neuroscience, but what CCST allowed me to do was be very immersed in such a rich learning environment so that you can go wherever you want. One key thing I will say before I yield my time is that the most valuable thing for me, most of all, has been the relationships. This community is so real to me. The connections that you make, the partnerships, the friendships, I'm so positive to last a lifetime. And so coming out of academic science where there's a bit of, are these my people? Do I belong? Yes, a bit, but not quite in this way. It was immediately apparent to me that this, group of folks who are so passionate about this mission to advance science for the common good is someplace where I look forward to having the rest of my career in this space. So if what we're saying is resonating with you, CCST may be a good fit.
Thank you very much, Chanel. We're now going to move into kind of our questions. So please, attendees, please continue asking your questions and typing them in the Q&A box on your Zoom. But the first question we have is on the placement process and how that works. I'll explain a little bit about how that works administratively, and then if one or two of the panelists can share a little bit about your experience of that process. So the placement process will happen at the beginning of the fellowship. So after your training and orientation, the CCST will set up interviews for you with all of the interested host offices. And so the offices will interview the fellows, and the fellows will get a sense of what the offices offer. And so there's a matching process where the fellows will rank the offices that they're most interested in working in for their fellowship year. The offices will select the fellows that they feel that they match with. So it's both, the match can often be topic interest, but can also be a personality fit. Like, is this an office in which you might want to work in and such? So we take all of that into account for CCST, as well as our partners in the California legislature and executive branch to make the right fits and matches for the fellows for that year. Any panelists want to share a little bit about your experience of that process? Lashe.
Geoff, correct me if I'm wrong. I think we had like 31 interviews that we went on to find our match.
I think it's higher.
It's a pretty lengthy process. It takes a while, but it was really affirming that this is where I should be, and that when I put my list together of like what offices did I want to be in, most of them I was like, I could totally see myself here. But I think one thing that was really surprising was that my top 10 were all in the executive branch, which I did not expect. And I was like, oh, I think maybe I want to be. So it just really reveals sort of some things that you may not know about yourself as you're meeting with these different offices. It can be exciting. And it also, I think, one of the biggest things was I was less afraid to go on job interviews afterwards, because I was like, I've done so many interviews, like I get how interviews work. This is gonna be fine. Like I was really not as paranoid towards the end of the fellowship going on job interviews.
Yeah, I would just piggyback on that a little bit and say the 30 plus interviews is not nearly as daunting as it may sound initially, because one of the great things about the program, or at least this year, there are 15 fellows and 30 plus offices looking. So you are in fact the thing of value there. It's not, you're not fighting with other folks to try and get a single job. It's like the offices are oftentimes the ones trying to impress you and hoping that you rank them highly. So it really is like this super low stakes in the sense that the worst possible outcome is just, hey, you realize it's not a great fit. And it does give you a chance to really find a workspace where it does sort of match the work style that you're looking for. So for example, Lashe's placement with the Air Resources Board was directly related to her dissertation work and her background, whereas my placement was was about as far away from my research background as you can get. And in fact, on paper, I would not necessarily have expected that this would be an office that I would be placed in or even be able to excel in. But after the interview process and sort of doing that soul searching, CCST did a great job of recognizing some things about me and my work style that I didn't necessarily even appreciate about myself.
Thanks, Geoff. Here's a question about kind of what to do prior to applying. So for people, for you all, what activities did you participate in while a graduate student that that you think helped make you a strong candidate for the fellowship? Or probably another way to frame it is that really helped you while you were a fellow. Like, what were the activities that had some direct connection?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. Coming into the fellowship in year 2019, I was 2 years out from my PhD, and so had used that time, as sort of I alluded to before, just sort of gathering as many skills, training, and professional development experiences that I could that were available to me in the area. And so while a graduate student, I was engaged with Johns Hopkins Science Policy Group, which I founded. On that note, many of you may have a university-based science policy group at your current institution, which should provide a platform for you to engage in programming, et cetera. And then from there, there were a number of sort of short, 3 to 6 month long internships or fellowships in the Dallas, Maryland, Virginia area. And so I did some biomedical advocacy with Research America. I also did quite a bit of volunteering with Society for Neuroscience. Many research member societies will offer opportunities for students or recent graduates to guest write on their website, to take control of their social media handle for a day and talk about, policy issues from their point of view. Let's see, I worked for a brief but very stimulating time with a DoD think tank in Arlington, where I learned about the national security side of microtechnology issues. And so the diversity of these experiences, number one, sort of helped refine for me how much I wanted to be in the legislature, because that was something I had not yet been exposed to. It also, for me, was very illuminating of how I'm quite fine being a generalist. It was actually a bit of fresh air to get outside of neuroscience and think about the role of science and technology in natural resources or national security or what have you, because that sort of suits my my personality. But for folks who might not have access to these types of opportunities too, science policy doesn't have to be in the name of the program. Many people start with science communications, science outreach. We were putting on science, what was it called? It was science in the food, what's it called when you're farmer's market, science in the farmer's market, where if mom or dad was shopping for squash, you would sort of take the kids aside for little displays of adhesion on water molecules, or explaining genetics using different types of flowers. And so anything that allows you to practice engaging with non-academic audiences, science on tap, 1 minute thesis, talks, all of that is incredibly relevant to preparing you for a career where you spend a lot of time developing relationships, a lot of time talking to different audiences on a topic, a lot of time sort of translating dense technical jargon-filled information into accessible prose. So there are a lot of ways to do that that don't necessarily have policy in the title that I'm sure you'd have access to wherever you're currently based.
Any other panelists want to answer that?
I would say, oh, sorry, Sydney.
Oh, go ahead.
I would say I was very shocked and impressed by my peers and being like, whoa, you did all of those things. Those are so cool. Like, I did not have any policy background before coming to this fellowship. I would say most of my extracurriculars were, as Chanel mentioned, more so around science communication. Like, I had done a museum fellowship where I got to talk about my science, but I did not have a policy background at all when I applied.
Yeah, and just to jump on, Chanel mentioned a lot of folks start with science communication, and that was really how I got my foot in all this. I'm a physicist, but I never found physics easy to learn, ever. And so I think from like a really early age, I had this deep appreciation for anyone who could explain things really clearly to me, and I wanted that skill. So when I was a grad student, I basically carved out opportunities to do various kinds of science outreach, and my department didn't really have its own like science outreach group, so I'd like meet random people. Like I met a elementary school teacher on a bike ride and ended up doing outreach with her class. And it was interactions like that where I really had to think about, okay, how do I take what I'm doing in my research, but translate it into just everyday language? I think that was something that was tremendously helpful for me in the skills, building the skill set that I used as a fellow.
And I would just use this opportunity to plug CCST's Science Translator program, which is a sort of like a much smaller dip your toe in the pool science communication training activity where they bring graduate students and postdocs to the California Capitol to pitch legislatures and staff on your current research, which was a program that I did. I remember giving my spiel to Chanel in the Capitol and being
That's
like,
right.
and sort of being like, oh, I can actually do this. Like, I want to be like Chanel. That is a program that CCST also does, that if folks are interested in sort of maybe a smaller commitment to see if it's something that they're interested in, is a really cool new program, or it's not that new, but it's a really cool program.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Jeffrey, because CCST, the fellowship, exists in a broader science policy opportunity ecosystem. And so if you're interested in learning more or about other CCST, adjacent opportunities, the National Science Policy Network, NSPN, where I serve as their mentorship and professional development coordinator, is a great place to find community and also to plug into existing programs and activities like op-ed writing, memo writing, various campaigns, the Get Out the Vote campaign, science communication and outreach campaigns. This is a community that focuses really on empowering and elevating initiatives that are brought to us by our members, which are mostly PhDs and postdocs interested at that science, research, policy, civic engagement intersection. So there are many CCST current fellows and alumni that are engaged in that network, including myself. So if you're looking for a good place to get started, in addition to CCST's Translator Showcase, NSPN has a lot to offer. So I'll go ahead and pop a link in the chat if you're interested in finding us there.
Thank you. And to answer the question a bit on the programmatic end, just to emphasize a lot of what the panelists have said, you do not have to have a huge policy background to apply or be successful in this fellowship. You will get all the training and experience you need through it. Just communicate in your application materials and your interview, your willingness to learn, your open-mindedness and ability to communicate. I think that's the skill that I was hearing from a lot of the panelists. Awesome. Well, here's an interesting question kind of related to thinking about the impact of your work and impact of being a fellow, as well as just kind of being in the policy world. I'm just gonna read it verbatim. I'm very interested in helping to affect change via policy, but I'm unclear whether I would have more impact working through CCST or, for example, getting a biotech job and donating a substantial amount of income to advocacy groups. I realize this question is somewhat individual and may be difficult to address, but I'm curious about the previous fellows' opinions. Any comments?
I can take a swing at it. Yeah, I would say that it's going to come down to sort of a personal judgment of values and sort of also a measurement of where you view your skills to be best. Like for me personally, I knew that based off sort of my work style and things of that nature, I probably wouldn't be super successful in a biotech job working at this high-paying pharmaceutical company and being able to donate a portion of my salary and things of that nature, right? Like that is not where I personally feel that I am able to do my best work. And even in my year in the fellowship, just recognizing like the impact that I've been able to have on the conversation within my own office, right? Like there's 5 people in my office that work on legislation. And I recognize that that's just one vote out of 120 in the California state legislature. But right, like that's 20% of the entire voice of the discussion that's going on is coming from someone with my background. So for me personally, I think that I have more impact in the position that I was in this year than I would have in industry. But again, that ultimately is going to come down to your individual skills and the values that you have.
That's really beautifully said, Geoff. Going back to the idea of science policy as an ecosystem, I think folks tend to feel really fulfilled when the natural expression of their innate or native genius is what their role allows them to accomplish, right? So for me, as Geoff mentioned, I was sort of looking at my peers in lab who were just killing it at fundamental basic neuroscience, and I was like, that's not how I'm going to make my bread. My native skill where I feel like I found my lane is in supporting workforce development and advising and teaching and speaking. And so when you're sort of thinking, this is one way of thinking about the ecosystem of science policy, there's like a decision maker, which comes with its own set of challenges if you're an elected official. They are the staff of the decision maker. And then there's a community of advocates, around them. But then also there are all of the programs and offices that administer the programs created by those policies. And many of those programs end up being funded out of government, or if you go this route, by very generous private sector individuals. In fact, the CCST Science Policy Fellowship enjoys very generous sponsorship from private philanthropic organizations. And so if your innate and native genius is in biotech, and that's where you want to make an impact, and then as sort of a less proximal link to science policy, that's how you choose to invest yourself, that's amazing. And we need you to be part of that ecosystem. But I think the folks in this role find like a deep sense of personal satisfaction in the day-to-day nuts and bolts nature of the work, right? But it's not necessarily for everyone, and so I think that there is a seat for everyone at the table, but in how close to the epicenter of the decision making you want to be, that can be your personal preference and sort of based on how you want to express your talents.
I want to just follow up on what Chanel said, very much agreeing with what my fellow panelists said. But I think one more point to make too is that in this kind of work, you're having impact that goes beyond yourself. So, you have this sphere of influence of your own personal work, what you're actually doing, but just by being in this role, by serving this role, you're also, contributing broadly to an environment that facilitates communication between decision makers and scientists. So it's not only like what you're personally doing in your role, but also helping to build this world in which we have that dialogue that is so needed. So that's just one extra sort of cherry on top.
Thank you. Those are really great answers. Let's talk a little bit more, about the program. There's some questions about kind of the difference between a placement in the legislature, a placement in the executive branch. We have Lashe with us here, one of our first fellows that we've placed in the executive branch in this last cohort. But I guess since we also have fellows who've been, alumni who've been placed in a legislative committee office versus also a personal office. So if you guys could just share a little bit about kind of what sort of work did you do during your fellowship year, describe some of those projects for our attendees.
I'll start. I will say, for me, one of the things that excited me about the executive branch was, to some degree, I'm like, the law is the law, right? And I think some people get really excited about like, what does this law look like? But for me, I was really like, well, what happens once the law gets made? How does this get executed, right? Like, I think the executive branch is more of a slow burn, right? Like, you don't get your big win necessarily as you do with like passing a bill. But when you do get that win, it's like, wow, we just made this happen. And I think I was more okay with that. And I wanted to get into the nitty gritty of like, how do you make this work for 40 million people? I would say my work in the exec branch, it really depends on your agency. I would say it really varies. There were 5 fellows placed in the executive branch, and whenever I talked to my counterparts, we were all doing really different things. I would say being at CARB, it's like a very high profile agency, I would say. Mary Nichols is often in the news, especially given that Trump sues us a lot. And so it was really flashy. It was really exciting. It was really cool to give speaking points to a chair who was going to talk in front of a ton of people. There was this celebrity and excitement about it all that was really exciting. And on the other hand, I will say there's a lot of just research that needed to be done, right? Because CARB is an agency that cares a lot about science, I was never the only PhD in a room, which I think is very different than other placements. Oftentimes, I was talking to people who had been working on something for their entire careers, and everyone in the room had been doing this work for 20 plus years. And so there was a lot of expertise around me always that always made me very thoughtful about, like, okay, when the governor says this is what's going on, how does that happen in a real way despite the flashiness, right? Like, what are all the pieces that need to fall in place, and who are all the people that's going to make that happen? It was this like nexus, I think, in the exec branch for me.
I would give or I should say that my placement in a personal office is probably the furthest away from the executive branch and Lachey's experience. I sort of view it as the executive branch placements being the most structured, the policy committee placements being a little less structured than that. And then the personal offices are like the Wild West, is that we have the state constitution that we have to follow, but beyond that, there are very few rules. Rules that do exist can be broken with political will. If you have enough votes, those rules can be broken. So the California state legislature introduced in the last 2-year bill cycle over 5,000 pieces of legislation, right? Every single one of those ideas came from an elected member, from their staff, from outside groups, and they have to be filtered through the staff. So if I had ideas, I would pitch them. If they got the thumbs up, then I would run with it, right? So I had a ton of personal agency sort of over the portfolio that I had, as long as it was representing the senator and the constituents for which he serves, right? I can't go out and do whatever I want, but at least my portfolio was incredibly fluid and a lot of times based solely off whoever walked in the door each day.
I can follow up and speak a little bit about what it was like being a committee consultant. I'm sure Chanel has a different experience from me, and that's one of the unique things about working on a committee is they're all a little bit different. They all have their own flavor. So I would say, you know, broadly speaking, with Senate Natural Resources and Water, my job was really a lot of balancing. It was balancing really careful communication, sometimes sensitive information, all on a fast timeline and with a lot of different people involved. So, you know, day to day is like talking to lots and lots of different people. And, you know, folks from NGOs, advocates from outside the Capitol, legislative staff, people at the agencies. Fundamentally, my job is to say, okay, someone has this idea for policy. Does it solve a problem? Does it solve that problem well? Does it have unintended consequences? And how is it going to be implemented? And really to try to build in a pretty short timeline, a remarkably short timeline, a clear picture of the problem and how this piece of law is going to solve that problem. And so it's really I'm trying to think of a good analogy, almost like, you know, sitting on one of those exercise balls and you've got all these things you're trying to balance, but the ball's rolling along. It's exciting and fun and dynamic all at once. But I think every committee is a little bit different, and the amount that you interact with the legislators on the committee varies a lot from committee to committee too. So it's a pretty dynamic and versatile kind of experience.
Great, thank you all. We have a question here about many of you guys had, for your placements, were very different topics from your technical background and your PhD research. So what did you do to manage that transition as you entered into a very different policy arena?
I could take a stab at this too. So my background's astrophysics, and you know, there's really no way you can take astrophysics and convert it straight over into policy, because at least right now, nobody is legislating about black holes. I like to think eventually there'll be an interstellar commerce clause. I think the biggest key is to have a really open mind and to come with an attitude that's humble and that's willing to learn, to say, hey, I'm here to learn. For me, it was something that really spoke to my value of wanting to be of service. And so I came into this with an idea that, okay, I'm here to be of service, I'm here to learn. And those two sort of thoughts in my mind are what kept me moving forward. You already have all the skills you need to do this work. You know, your PhD, you may think of your PhD as it taught you all this technical stuff, but it didn't. What your PhD really taught you is how to teach yourself new things, how to manage projects, how to interact with people, how to share your research. And those are the skills you need for this role, and you already have them.
Yeah, I would. The word humility is, I think, the thing that jumps straight to mind. Come in with an open mind, know what you don't know, and yeah, poster session at a conference is almost exactly like a a meeting with with a stakeholder, and just sort of think of it that way. You know how to ask good questions. You know how to get to the root of the actual topic.
As with science, policymaking goes through a process. And it seems intimidating to us because we're unfamiliar with that process. But one can place a high level of confidence in CCST and also in your placement offices and your supervisors that they know what you need to know, and they will make it really clear. You know, here are our bread and butter work products. In my case, it was a committee analysis. A committee analysis follows, just like an academic paper, a rubric. There's an outline. There's a certain way you go about approaching questions, and so they don't expect you to come in, you know, automatically knowing that. In fact, by virtue of going through the fellowship experience, you're learning it as you go. And so, you know, my first bill, which I think dealt with scholarships for foster youth, I didn't know anything about the foster youth population, you know, what their needs were, how many were there in higher education. But as a scientist, you know where to get the answers, you know how to vet the quality of the information that's coming to you. One of my favorite things, though, really was negotiating amendments with advocates and lobbyists, because they come armed with all of their, you know, pamphlets and portfolios and statistics. And when you can say, oh, I'd like to see the original citation for that data, or what year was that taken from, or what's the confidence interval? Oh my goodness, it's a deeper level of you know, interrogation in these conversations. And so what you bring to the table is a very critically thinking mind. You bring a fresh perspective, you know, beginner's mind, being really humble. Another thing I sort of want to emphasize that was really something I didn't know that I would learn was appreciating that science in and of itself is not necessarily an answer. That data doesn't tell you what to do, right? Science is a framework by which you can better understand the consequences of a particular policy choice. But in the legislature, not only are you thinking about the science aspect, you're thinking about the labor aspect, the economic aspect, right? The relationships that the members are having to also keep in mind as they're voting on bills from their colleagues. And so again, thinking about science in an ecosystem, and we want science to matter. We want to advance data-driven thinking. Well, whose data? Whose story? Whose narrative? And how is it being presented? So I came out of it with a deep sense of, you know, humility at, wow, these problems are very complex, and science is one essential tool for thinking about them, in league with a lot of other things as well. And so that's another element of beginner's mind and humility that I think was just so enriching to my professional development.
Yeah, I think I just really need to like double down or triple down on this point of like, there's so much to learn this year. Like I was placed in, I studied air pollution and I was placed at an air pollution agency, but every day I'm like, wow, I had no idea that was a thing. Like our PhDs are so specific that even if it is in your field, like I was thinking about vehicle emissions. I was not thinking about climate change per se. And most of what I do is about climate change. And so like, even if it is in your field, you're still gonna have a lot to learn. So you might as well come in thinking like, I have what it takes to make it happen, but like I'm here to learn and really, really, yeah, just double down on that.
Thanks, Lashay, and those are great answers. Just to kind of wrap that answer all together is that CCST, we're not looking for like particular technical disciplines that we think will be fit. It's come, be really ready to learn and be open-minded for whatever you're kind of interested in. This is the year to kind of explore and figure out where you might fit. I think we have time for a few more questions, but I'm gonna ask the panelists to just do like one answer per question. So we have a question about networking. What are kind of the networking opportunities available during the fellowship? And then I think especially for those of you who were just wrapping up your fellowship, how is this affected by the pandemic?
There's so much networking. like your entire job is networking. This whole thing is you're talking to new people. I will say, if networking is something that you're sort of nervous about, like I was nervous about that word, and it's just all it is building relationships, and you will learn that relationships are social capital, and also people are very interesting, and so I think it becomes very easy to just, if you're interested, you will be networking, and it is definitely harder with the pandemic, I will say, but that's why you have mentors. That's why you have alumni networks. There are just so many fundamental things that are built into CCST framework that allows you to have a network of people to get to know. Like, I asked my mentor very early on, like, who are the top 10 people you think I should meet? And every time you meet with a person, you're like, who are 3 people you think I should meet with? Like, networking opportunities are abundant and endless.
Thanks, Lashe. Okay, I think this will be our last question before we kind of wrap up. And it's kind of about being introverted versus extroverted and the value of which one in this fellowship experience. So I'm friendly and social, but also an introvert. Could I be an introvert and still be successful in the fellowship and in science policy in general? I think the answer is yes. I know the answer is yes. Anyone like to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. I would say the thing that our fellow class struggled with the most, I would say, out of sort of like the unexpected struggles, was that none of us really have experience anymore talking to people on the phone. So like actually picking up the phone and calling people was like a very big emotional hurdle for a lot of the fellows this year, myself included. But yeah, I think every personality type will find a home in the legislature, right? And that is why the matching process for your placement office is so important, because those kinds of things are taken into account. You will be able to find a group of people that work the same way that you do.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for attending this webinar or watching this video if you're watching afterwards. Please don't hesitate to email me or any of the panelists if you guys want to share your contact information in the chat. Please feel free to do so. But I just wanted to wrap up this time to have the panelists just share a few words of advice or some prompting to apply to this fellowship, just any kind of final words that you want to leave the attendees and of this webinar. I think let's go backwards through our list. So let's start with Chanel.
Oh gosh, sure. I guess I want to say, really what the fellowship sort of allowed me to do was to own that space, to really take pride in the role I had in serving as an advocate for science, an advocate for scientific data. And, you know, in the legislature, it is a politicized environment just by nature of, you know, you're working for a member. And I know that perhaps some folks may feel concerned that, well, I don't want my science to be politicized. One thing I will say that I learned about being in that context is if you're not speaking up for yourself and the things that you care about, other people are going to be speaking about the things that are important to them and that they care about. So don't relinquish your right, you know, to be a valid, a vocal, and a compassionate, you know, advocate for an issue that speaks closely to you. Yes, we're scientists, but we're also human beings. So looking at the world around us, and all of us probably have a particular policy issue where we think that there needs to be, you know, a fight for change. CCST sort of allows you to understand how to navigate the levers of government, and in order to make that happen, you learn about how to negotiate with people inside of your coalition, but also across coalitions, how to have a emotional or tense policy conversation with someone who disagrees from you, but ultimately you still maintain a high level of professionalism, you know, and respect. And so for folks that are interested in learning what it takes in this context to be a game changer, to be an advocate, to be a leader, to be a thinker at a very high level, this could be a very enriching experience for you. And also the CCST community, and perhaps I'm biased, I'm a part of it, is amazing. And you'll learn so much from your peers and be so inspired by all that they accomplish, both in the fellowship and certainly with all the opportunities that they pursue afterwards. So I'm so glad that I participated. It's been very life-changing and life affirming. And so I'll put my contact information in the chat. I'd be so happy to have a info interview with those of you that'd like to learn more about my journey.
Thanks, Chanel. Geoff?
Yeah, I would echo everything that's been said on this call to this point. The fellowship has truly been the most transformative portion of my life to this point, including my doctorate. I came out of grad school not knowing what I wanted to do, and I think I found my home. It's been really transformative. I would encourage anyone to reach out at any time with any questions. Some of the things that we didn't necessarily touch on today that you have questions about, love to talk about the program, about the political nature of some of the offices. I'm not even an American citizen, so if you have questions about navigating how that works, it's very weird, but I'm happy to chat about that as well. My email should be in the chat. Love to talk. I encourage everyone to apply if you can.
Thanks, Geoff. Lashe?
I fear that like we all sound like a bunch of saps. Like this changed my life, but I think that's very, very true. In going through some of the questions that were asked, a lot of it fits into like, will I fit, like people trying to figure out if they will fit into this. And I think the only thing that really matters is like, are you willing to commit to a year of being a servant? We are all public servants, and like that's what really matters. California is an extremely diverse state. So that means that it needs to be diverse, right? Like if you have a kid at home, your perspective matters, right? Like if you're an introvert, your perspective matters, right? Like we are serving a very diverse state and we need to reflect that diversity. And so I say, what you have to lose is just a year to figure something out. And at the very least, at the end of that year, you can say you did some good. And so I say, just bring your whole self. You are worthy, and like, come on over. Excited to meet you. I put my email in the chat as well. Very happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Lashe and Sydney.
It's pretty hard to add on. I think, I really resonate with what everyone else has said. And some days, I pinch myself at work because I'm like, wait, like I'm here doing this now, and it's amazing. I had no idea that I could land here, like in the role I have right now, doing the work I do. I love it. I'm tremendously grateful that a couple of years ago, like previous Sydney, decided to take the leap and apply. So, if you're thinking about it, try it, take the leap. As Lashe said, like, what do you have to lose? And you have so much to gain from it. So be brave, take a leap, come join us. It's a great place to be.
Thanks, Sydney, and thank you, panelists, so much for your time and for your wisdom and just sharing about how this experience has changed your life and as well as mine. I can also say, as an alum of this program, this has completely transformed my career. And so I welcome any questions. Both please reach out to the panelists, reach out to myself. I know we didn't get to all the questions, so please don't hesitate to reach out. But thank you so much for your time, and that'll be the end of the webinar.